Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this CSIS event. I'm excited about this event, not just because of the wonderful panelists that we have on here, but also because we've released a new paper today that you can find on the CSIS website. It's entitled Reaching Farther, Risking Less. And this is a great paper that Rose Bouchard put together with some of her other colleagues here at CSIS that looks at how we're using remotely crewed systems for ISR and for other missions, how that fits into great power competition. And it also goes back and looks at funding for these systems, not just in the air domain, but across all of the domains, and looks at trends in funding for remotely crewed systems and what that might mean for the future. This was a joint project here within CSIS between the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group that's led by Andrew Hunter and his great group of folks there, and the Aerospace Security Project that I lead. But the main person who did the lion's share of the work on this project was Rose. She's going to be moderating the panel discussion today. Before I hand it over to her, I just want to thank our sponsors, in particular General Atomics, who provided sponsorship to CSIS. It helps make this possible, the report and the event. But without further ado, Rose, I want to hand it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Todd. And thank you, Todd, both for your remarks, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. I'd like to introduce our two panelists, Dr. Will Roper and Dr. Rebecca Grant. Dr. Grant is the president of Iris Research and appears regularly as a national security analyst on CNN, Fox News, and the Smithsonian Channel. Before founding Iris Independent Research, she worked for RAND and on the staff of the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and her PhD is from the London School of Economics. Dr. Roper is the CEO of Valancy and through the beginning of this year served as the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Before that, he held roles in the Department of Defense as Director of the Strategic Capabilities Office and at the Missile Defense Agency. He holds degrees from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. Dr. Roper, first question for you. I know one of the things that this brief looks at is how the U.S. government invests in remotely crewed systems as we turn back towards great power competition. Recent years have really shown a steep decline in sort of the unclassified Air Force spending on remotely crewed systems, although of course we don't see what might be shifting towards the classified realm, which would include a lot of the technology that really powers pure competition. From your experience in government, do you think that the decrease in unclassified funds might be replaced by future classified funds? And sort of from outside government, how can people in the sort of think tank and private sector partner with government to meet challenges that we can't necessarily see?
It's a very good question, Rose, and it has no really good answer, but I'll give you some thoughts this morning. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be with Rebecca. Thank you, CSIS, for hosting this. And thanks also for using the term uncrewed air systems. I think we need to get that term to be adopted by the DoD writ large. I don't think that's been done formally yet. Look, it's just the nature of the beast that as you start competing against peers, that more of your work is going to go into the classified domain. It's challenging to work in the classified domain, especially in the Internet of Things, as more things become connected, as data becomes more readily available, as sensors are more ubiquitous. And that's going to be a challenge for all nations, not just for us. In terms of how think tanks should think about this, I think the government will have to change its posture both with industry and think tanks if it really wants to tap the gray matter power that you represent. If you don't know how we would go to war, how can you help us think about the nature of war and how to be prepared for it as it changes? And in the past, the government had closer relationships with non-government organizations, even industry, ensuring that they understood the capabilities that we had, the way that we would use them in war, the challenges that we had. And I think that can be done in a way that preserves proprietary information. But as the acquisition beast lured its head after McNamara, and we became more and more entrenched in a very stodgy, antiquated process where fairness was overtaken by process for its own sake, the divide between the government and industry got bigger and bigger. So now most industry and think tanks do not know what the government wants, and the government can't really share. So we've divided and conquered ourselves in this nation. I think one thing that the government will have to get better at is having partnerships with entities outside the government that work very differently than partnerships worked in the Cold War, that was mainly based on purchasing. So fascinating topic. I know it's not necessarily the one for today, but the question you ask is indicative of the government isolating itself on an island where everyone else is in a boat far away from the shore, looking through a periscope.
Well, thank you. I think partnerships is definitely an important theme. Dr. Grant, another trend that the report really highlights is that while a bit of a latecomer, the Navy is quickly overtaking the Air Force in unclassified spending on remotely crewed systems. Something we saw earlier this month with sort of the creation of the Navy's new Task Force 59, and with yesterday's missile launch from a remotely crewed surface vehicle. How might the Navy spending increase and the new task force sort of complement and change the existing force structure?
Well, great question. And first off, I'd say, great, it's about time. You know, the Navy, of course, did a lot of work even with unmanned air vehicles back in the late Vietnam timeframe. We know they've done some tremendous work in the undersea domain all along, but there was definitely a lull as the Air Force really adopted Predator and Reaper. And we saw the Navy initially, based on some bad early experiences, very resistant to the sort of larger medium range endurance types of UAVs. Well, you know, all that has changed. We know, of course, that it took a long time for what became MQ-25 to make it out of the various factory floors and into the testing for the fleet. So I think in a way the Navy has been slow to adopt. But having said that, when you look across the department of the Navy's portfolio now, it's just staggering. And don't forget, they sort of uniquely have to work in so many different domains. Even if you just look at what they're doing in undersea vehicles, it's just, you know, it's unbelievable. And there's such different types, from the very small to the Orca, the very big. And, you know, the undersea realm is crucial. We regard that as a place where we still have a lot of dominance. We have to maintain that dominance. And the way that the Navy does that with the unmanned undersea vehicles is incredibly elaborate. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in that, but I say to them, go to it. This is absolutely vital that gets accomplished. They also, of course, with the Marine Corps, have requirements for land-based uncrewed systems. And they have a great phrase. They talk about needing to lighten the cognitive burden as well as the physical burden. So some great thinking there in their land piece through their marine component. And then, of course, what we see in the aviation side. You know, you look at something like an uncrewed system. I'll try to be correct there, Dr. Roper, and just instead of saying UAS, something that can both carry fuel and do some sensor work as well. You know, I see some tremendous investment there. And I'm frankly practically overlooking some of the earlier investments that they did, which were within their surface fleet, where they were leaders all along, grabbing the Scan Eagle off the tuna boat and saying, hey, I think this might work for us in this environment. I love what they've done with Task Force 59 because it's operational, it's experimenting, and it's already deterring potential adversaries. You know, it's already something for Iran to look at. So I love everything they see there. I think the Navy has the challenge that we all see in this area, and that is going to be how to link all this information into the naval grid and then into the joint all-domain information construct. Okay, some pieces aren't going to be linked. I think a lot of that undersea stuff is going to stay somewhat in its own realm, but pieces of it will need to be linked together for specific mission applications. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, for the Navy, which is very used to sort of having its own operational concepts and to try to bring those into the joint domain. I know they want to do that, and that's something they'll be very focused on going forward. Sorry, long answer. I could obviously go on all day, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. And I think to pull on one of those threads, and the thread of returning to sort of pure competition and great power competition, Dr. Roper, I know when you were director of the Strategic Capabilities Office, one of the remarks you made was that one of the things we're going to have to remember is that we did quite well in the Cold War, is to maintain a good balance between the capabilities that we show to the world for deterrence versus the ones we keep behind the door for warfighting overmatch. Probably said it with much less hesitation than I just did. But now that the world is returning to great power competition, how much of that sort of holds true today?
All of it holds, but the methods will change. And there's a wonderful opportunity in everything the military does to shape and to influence for the better. And I would say, on the whole, the Pentagon has lost the ability to do that. That tradecraft went away at the end of the Cold War. It wasn't needed as much against terrorist groups countering violent extremists. A different form of it was needed, but not the same tradecraft that's needed to influence a nation state. And I remember pitching early programs in the Strategic Capabilities Office. Many of them were unmanned or uncrewed now systems for the Navy, Ghost Fleet and Undertaker, that went on to become the programs that the Navy is looking to field today. It was a very contentious thing then because it was still very unpopular to think about having uncrewed systems within the Navy. But one way I was able to get projects over the goal line is to say, even if you don't pursue it, the value of having it and demonstrating it and determining how you bury that thread away from public view has huge power. So it matters what we spend our money on, it matters what capabilities we have, but it matters equally as much how we spend our money to influence the perceptions of our adversaries and allies. We're not just buying capability, we're buying perception. Deterrence is a perception. So if we don't get that tradecraft back, we could very easily build a military that is capable of winning a war, but not build a military that is capable of deterring a war, which is our ultimate objective. So this is an area that think tanks, that RANDs, that CSISs can really help the Pentagon get back into, to look at the technologies it has and determine which ones can be safely shown and to what degree and in what manner. And then how much time does that buy you? It's like playing speed chess, right? A move that you make stops the clock and starts it for the other side. And this goal of revealing and concealing is all about playing speed chess better. The things that you show create more uncertainty, more response time in your adversary than they cost you to make. And I will tell you, that is not the way that the budget in today's military is built. And so I strongly tried to bring that back. That's an area where I will admit I was not able to make as much headway as I would have liked. I think we made some good strides, but nothing that really looked at every budget as a new strategic shaping opportunity. So for those who are entering the Pentagon, like CSIS's Andrew Hunter, to take my old job, and I wish him Godspeed, this is a great thing to bring in to every decision, that we're not just buying capability, we're buying perception too.
Thank you. That is an incredible thing to keep in mind. Dr. Grant, I know one of the many hats that you wear is that of a military historian, which is a particularly useful hat when you're looking at something as long-term as developing and fielding new fleets of remotely crewed systems and sort of trying to build deterrence over the long haul. Some of the investments the U.S. has made in its military technology shape the ways that it's engaged in conflicts before, and then sort of as the U.S. Moves out of Afghanistan and turns its focus to China and Russia, how should it prioritize for future conflicts?
Well, China is the priority. I think that if you asked any senior leader in the military today, you would probably get that very same answer. That Russia obviously is a capability we have to really keep an eye on. Still an incredibly important deterrence relationship there, and that there are many other tasks that the military has to carry out, from humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, right through counterinsurgency. None of that's going away. But no question, and I think Dr. Roper's work has pointed this out too, is that China really is the peer that we must plan to oppose. And every year we go from being ahead to being up. Now we're really not ahead. So our unmanned systems are vital here, and I think that there's quite a dividing line. You see some that have been incredibly successful, and I think particularly something like Global Hawk, where it has been able, it got its baptism by fire in counterinsurgency warfare in Afghanistan, yet it's also really used and has a great operational record in the Pacific, looking to see where stuff is at, right? And I think that with China particularly, we talk about something as just direct as the targeting problem. China has a big Navy and 16,000 shipping vessels that can theoretically be co-opted into some nasty type of setup, right? So just the issue of trying to track where the enemy is, where your friendly forces are, and where your allies are, and what's going on in that Pacific theater, that's always been the problem right through from World War II on. We really need to have unmanned capability there. We also want to see what we can do. This is a big interest of the Army in terms of long-range fires. Not only will they deploy more missiles in that for that mission, but they're looking at how their future vertical lift programs and other unmanned programs can play into the long-range fires equation. So, I think there's no question, but if you had to say, what's a discriminator for investment in, I keep saying unmanned, uncrewed systems, what's a discriminator for investment in uncrewed systems? You want something that helps you with that China fight. Now, it could be a very diverse, it could be anything from delivering cargo and more munitions right through the more traditional ISR piece, or into assisting with that self-healing, self-forming network that everybody needs for this theater. But focusing on what helps us with that China equation is key. Some of it is more, maybe not what you think. One of the biggest issues for the Air Force, as Dr. Roper knows, is base defense. Where do you use your uncrewed systems? And they could be a big variety of types there for assisting with base defense, not only in the Pacific theater, but in other areas as well. But again, China has to be the discriminator. Your unmanned system that you want to invest in or make the case for has to really work in that environment. And that gets directly to another question I'm sure Dr. Roper will want to talk about too, and that is the relative survivability and the application of some of these unmanned systems in that environment. Because of the ISR lineage of a lot of them, particularly the air-breathing ones, we sort of said, well, it can fly high, it can do this, and we have a lot of them, go forth and do the mission. We now really have to think about survivability, not only for the platform, but for mission accomplishment as well.
Rosal, let me pick up on something that Dr. Grant said. And the Pacific is going to drive a completely different formalism for using uncrewed systems. And the first thing that we have to state is that none of the systems we have today in the military are actually uncrewed. They're exceptionally crewed. The crew just isn't in the air. In fact, in the Air Force, and I think this is also true for the Navy, the uncrewed systems often require more people than piloted systems do. If you take into account the total ecosystem around the platform, operating it, doing the exploitation of the data, as well as maintaining it. And so, although the military has moved into systems that don't have people on them, and you can take greater operational risk with them, and that has operational value, it hasn't really dropped the infrastructure or logistics footprint needed to operate them. And I think that the China fight is going to motivate that most of all. We're far from home. Infrastructure is difficult. It's easy to damage. People are hard to get there quickly. It's hard to maintain comms with them. So the thing that's missing in uncrewed systems in the military is true autonomy. And that is an area where commercial markets are far leading us. And since leaving the Air Force, I've moved now into the drone line of business as one of the things that I do. Autonomy is not a nice to have, it's a must have. You can't be profitable in any kind of drone industry, whether it's logistics or sensing, if you have a lot of people or infrastructure as part of your equation. You can't be profitable doing it. So commercial markets are driving a higher and higher degree of autonomy, whereas the defense industrial base responding to military requirements is still really providing uncrewed systems that have the same size crew on the ground, and that construct will not convey very well to the Pacific.
Thank you very much for both of your answers to that question, and I think that is a something that we definitely were conscious of as we put together this report. And I know Todd has alluded to in some of his earlier work, is that this is one stage in a continuing development of technology. And as a reminder to the audience, we will be opening up at the end of this panel for audience questions. If you do have questions for our panelists, you can submit them through the button on the registration page or directly under the video player if you are watching it on our website. And picking up on that thread, I know, Dr. Roper, you've had a chance to work on a lot of different cutting edge technology development, not only in your this role, your most recent role, and then as director of the SCO. How do different agencies bring different perspectives to the table when we're talking about developing those new capabilities?
Well, a lot of government organizations, when they're innovating, they're very much a function of the way they've done their mission. And that was something that I saw when I started working for Secretary Carter and then Secretary Mattis in the Strategic Capabilities Office. There was a soft fear that anything new would threaten the old paradigm in a way that would ultimately be deleterious to that organization. So a fear of innovation had come in. And so I think that's true across the government as a whole, except in a few special pockets. You could say special operational forces, and NASA continues to be an area of great creativity. DARPA continues to be an area of great creativity. So something that was systemic in government is fear that innovation would create a new paradigm where there would be losers and the loser would be you. And I used to talk about this with multiple Navy admirals about there once was a battleship, and the battleship was the key of the Navy. And then the airplane launching off of ships made the battleship obsolete overnight. Then the aircraft carrier became the centerpiece of the Navy. And now with myriad anti-ship missiles, when will that paradigm that the aircraft carrier is now being obsolesced, and therefore there needs to be a new construct for naval power, which very much could center around uncrewed systems as its central construct. Why is there fear that the new will be worse? And one thing I was very pleased to see in the Air Force, I had no experience running an organization of that size. It was all trial and error for me. But you really can reshape culture if you've got the right message and mission. And so we focused really closely on China and need to innovate. And I saw the Air Force slowly let go of the fighter as it has been, as its central identity, and really embrace innovation as its central identity. Whatever it is, whatever flavor it is, whatever the impact is, always stay up with things that are new and trending. And without General Goldfein and General Brown, that would have never happened. It was driven by an operational imperative to be current and to be relevant. I think that same culture reboot is what's needed across the government, across all agencies and services, is don't fear that losing the past will lead to a less bright future. I'm a big believer that the future is always better as long as you're on the forefront of helping shape it. And that's something that the military can have a huge hand in doing. As the first adopter of most areas of deep tech, it cannot just shape the way that military technology evolves. It can have a huge hand in shaping how commercial technology evolves. And the way the Air Force has been engaging with electric aviation is one example of the powerful catalytic effect that the military could have on the entire tech ecosystem, and that takes its role to be not just one of safety and a guarantor of national security, but one that is actually a catalyst and accelerator of economic prosperity. And if you look at China's model with a fused civilian military strategy, the power of centralization is a power we should fear. And right now, our military, our .gov market is reasonably separated and isolated from the dot-com market. That's a danger long term. But how are we going to engage that market that's moving so fast, driven by private investment and venture capitalism, is we can't fear the future. We have to kill our sacred cows, be iconoclasts that are always trying to reinvent what we do. And I think across government, we talk that talk, but we're not walking the walk in terms of taking true risk. So celebrating true risk takers, I think, is the final litmus test for the rank and file in government to say, okay, this is how we operate now.
If I could add to that.
Please do.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree with so much of that. And one way that it moves really fast in the unmanned area is when there's an urgent combat need, right? The Predator Reaper era came about because of the 1999 war in the former Yugoslavia. There was a need to not only fly at the time the Predator around, but for it to be able to deliver coordinates that could then be passed for airstrikes or for other purposes. So getting mensurated coordinates on, and this became an urgent combat need within the Air Force. They just knocked things aside, worked it, and got the system up and running so quickly, and it flourished from there. We've seen numerous other examples of that, like Dr. Roper, you mentioned the battleship. I mean, the Navy held on to the battleship concept because it had so much more lethal tonnage at the time than the F-4F Wildcat, right, did. But when Midway and other encounters proved that the lethality was there in the new system, well, the combat requirement was met, and so we go forward. I think one of the challenges as we come out from counterinsurgency to great power conflict is setting up the conditions that in an experimental fashion replicate what that combat need is, so that you see the clear alignment of you've got soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and space operators who want this system because it does this task. It kills this target, or it finds this one, or it can hang out under the water and do X, Y, Z. When you can set up conditions where that's there, then things can move very, very quickly. When there's a bit of a less clear relationship as to, hey, what does this really do for me, then it's very difficult. I mean, I think you see the great adoption of uncrewed technologies within the explosive ordnance disposal area as being something that, okay, obviously really, really needed. So, and I think this is true as we look at combining the brain power of the military or .gov arena with the .com arena. What can government experimentation, that sounds wrong, let me make that military experimentation, do? What can they do in setting up uncrewed systems to take on, cargo delivery or ISR tasks? How can that flow back and forth between the commercial side and the government side? That's the synergy I think we'd all really like to see. Some of it's there now, but we'd like to see more. And I think that is what would help keep us ahead, especially in the areas where we need to be ahead. It's not so much the, as the aircraft manufacturers say, the outer mold line. You look at unmanned aircraft, they're pretty simple, or they're based on known principles. The Navy's big zoo of craft are based on known technology principles in the way they're formed. It's really the information inside that's key. And Dr. Roper pointed that out. It's that where you need the synergy, and you need, I think, this experimentation to take place to develop the urgent requirement and to bring in that commercial and military side together.
Regulatory challenges are also something the military can help with, and I've experienced that with helping get electric aircraft certified, which was easy for us to do in the military, harder for the FAA to do without the precedent. If you look at the emerging commercial drone market, especially for delivery and logistics, and the company I run is one of them, you're capped at 55 pounds gross takeoff weight, and only a few places where you can fly beyond line of sight. So 55 pounds gross takeoff weight is a small Group 2 UAS, or now uncrewed system. That's not what's ultimately going to be needed to change the economy if aerial logistics is going to be a part of it. So if you go to civilian regulators, approving something that's a few hundred pounds or a few thousand pounds to fly through the air autonomously and deliver things is a very huge challenge that they don't have a precedent doing. It's a very straightforward challenge for the military to take on. So it's an example of the military cannot just be a provider of security. If it decided to engage this market and to put its investment, its testing opportunities, its demonstration opportunities towards it, either return in terms of military advantage, it would likely spark a new industry as well. And as you see Joby and Archer now going public, the electric aviation industry is happening, arguably because of military engagement early in the market when it was still challenged by regulatory issues as well as deep tech adoption. So if we don't do that, we're going to lose to China long term, because they're going to have the advantage of their full whole of government opportunity, whole of government, whole of nation opportunities for every tech market they push. And we'll lose over time. Even if we win one of the tech races, over time, that model will be superior to a US tech ecosystem that's commercially focused, divided from military opportunities.
And then a question for you both, I guess starting with Dr. Grant. From your perspective, do you think the Air Force is becoming more open to expanding the use of remotely crewed aircraft beyond ISR and some strike missions to do things like airlift, like aerial refueling, and otherwise assert air dominance?
Yes, when it works out. I think there's a bit of a myth about the Air Force's resistance overall. And going back to my Predator example, one thing that made that weapon system successful very early on was that the Air Force Chief of Staff at the time yanked F-15 pilots and F-16 pilots, fighter pilots, out of their weapon system and said, you know how to fly, and you're going to fly this thing. And it's a little, finicky, and it only goes 70 miles an hour in a headwind, but we want this weapon system to succeed. And that is part of what made that system useful, back in that time period 20 years ago. So I think that there's, the Air Force, they want to get the job done. And if the unmanned version can do it, great. Now, there are technology sweet spots. Obviously, high altitude reconnaissance is a technology sweet spot. Not that means the Air Force has entirely given up on other systems, but there are real sweet spots there. We've the automated air refueling. While I've watched this evolve for a long time, it's not the easiest thing in the world. It turns out, it's not easy to do it. I think if you're a human operator, I haven't done it, but I sat in the back of the F-16 while it went on. Right, didn't look that easy, but it turned out to have some software-related challenges. And what the Air Force or any other service wants is to be sure that they have the mission assurance. I need to get this job done. I can't just say, hey, it really didn't work out, so, the jet had to divert or, eject or what have you, right? You can't just end up going down that road. Other missions, and then there are some where there's just a feeling, rightly so, that we want a human not only in the loop, but really there, and I'm talking about in the missile silo and in the nuclear bomber. It's sort of an old saying, tell me when you'd be comfortable having a B-2 go out as an optionally manned type of mission. Well, probably not ever. So but all of these flow from operational requirements, right? They're not random, and they all flow from direct operational requirements. So where it makes sense for unmanned systems to be a major part of that team, that will happen. And you see that in the thing that to me is the predominant military concept here across all the services, and that is, of course, manned-unmanned teaming. It's not new, it's been around for a while, but everyone is working at improving that manned-unmanned interface. Tremendous research in so many avenues, from the kind of the crew dynamics to the technology piece. Remember, really all this is happening within a manned-unmanned teaming environment now and for the foreseeable future. To Will Roper's point, that we need to see, some systems really do need to have more autonomy and complete autonomy. And again, that's for mission accomplishment. And yet, remember, this all nests within what the war colleges would call the operational level of war. We're talking about application at the tactical level, whether that's weapons effects or cargo delivery or surveillance. Remember, this all, someone sends that unmanned system to the theater for a reason. That's the operational level. That is always predominantly the human in charge.
I saw huge progress with the Air Force, and I think what I thought, or what I did experience a little bit when I was in the Strategic Capabilities Office, I really saw change under General Goldfein's leadership. And he asked me to come be the Air Force Acquisition Executive and introduced me to Heather Wilson, who became a great friend. But it is a huge advantage when a service knows that the chief wanted you to run acquisition, because it means the crazy ideas you're bringing in are things that the chief is nodding his or her head to. There's broad acceptance that this is the future for the Air Force, and the young pilots and crew that are coming in, they're excited about being on the forefront of bringing autonomy and AI to systems, which just isn't the case today. And I think it's broadly believed that the military has more capable AI than we do. We don't have any AI operationally of any extent that we could brag about. So the areas that I see will be quick to move to this are going to be very repetitive or very dangerous missions. So attritable systems was a big initiative that the Air Force got excited about, having small uncrewed mini fighters flying alongside any fighter in inventory, including the next generation fighter. That's just common sense, that when you can geometrically break up what in the past was the sensor, shooter, and human, the decision authority all being in one point of space and time, and you can break it up, that you can do things like take advantage of geometry or take greater risk with the uncrewed system that you wouldn't do when a pilot is there. That's just obvious, and that will happen. The very repetitive things will happen. Flying surveillance or doing logistics and delivery is a simple mission. It's an important mission, but one that we can have autonomy take on. The thing that is not understood, and I wish we had more focus on it and more research on it, is that the future where we turn over very complicated tactical missions to pure autonomy is a future away from the future. AI in its current instantiation is very brittle, and that's not well understood because there's not a peer adversary trying to defeat the AI that's helping you find cat videos online. There's no adversary there. In any future context of war, there will be. And AI is very brittle if it's exposed to a scenario about which it has very little training data. And humans are pretty good at understanding when they're out of where they're comfortable or when something doesn't appear right. We're very good at doing pattern recognition. So when I was championing putting AI on a military system, we finally got it done for the first time on the U-2, one of those high altitude piloted reconnaissance planes that the Air Force is holding on to, but one that was very amenable to be modified quickly. When I was talking with the pilots about how to train with the AI, it was really exciting to see their eyes open up, because it wasn't like having a traditional co-pilot, which the AI really was. It was like having a co-pilot with a completely different skill set, one that could be completely complementary to the one the human brought in. So when the human is overwhelmed by data overload, the Army or the Marine Corps is challenged, the AI being able to take over and simply process faster and have a tighter OODA loop. Or when the AI is confused because the adversary is doing tactics specifically designed to thwart it, that's where a human is going to be strong. Those same tactics will not fool humans. They're algorithmic stealth, they're algorithmic deception, not the kind of deception that would fool an eyeball or a human processor. There's going to be a new epoch of warfare, especially in the air domain, that will be very similar to when stealth first came and dogfighting changed to stealth-based penetration, and a whole generation of pilots had to get a new instinct for how to fly with this amazing technology that's been the hallmark of the Air Force for decades. Same thing is going to happen when AI finally finds itself into airplanes that we intend to put people in. We will find that creates the greatest strengths and the greatest weaknesses. And a new generation of pilot will have to learn to have the instinct about AI, even if they can't build the convolutional neural nets themselves. And there will be a generation, I believe, of red team, blue team, breaking AI, fixing AI, back and forth. And those are likely to be the most protected secrets that any military will have.
That seems like a fascinating world that we'll get to. And then bridging off that, Dr. Grant, I know one of the themes of much of CSIS's work this summer and this fall has been this hiding and finding, has been this attempt to conceal our own assets and reveal others. At the same time, as we fund one system, sometimes that means not funding a different one. So as we look at this trade-off, how are different operational regimes and sort of concepts of operations useful as we start looking at the future fight?
Excellent question, and I'll go to your theme of funding some things and not funding others. You know, that's I know who knows this better really than Dr. Roper, but the Air Force has had a really tough time moving on from its legacy force structure for internal reasons, and also because of the great attachment of so many on the Hill to systems that are proven. You know, I was just reading some up of one of the posture hearings and discussion about, well, if it's any less than 200 and some A-10s, this and that'll happen. And gosh, here there's nothing like the A-10. It's an amazing aircraft with a tremendous war record, flown by outstanding men and women. But it's not, it was built to be a titanium tank to help attrit Soviet armor in the Warsaw Pact scenarios. Possibly there are people in our audience who are not even really familiar with that. Well, that's before our time, Dr. Roper and I mean, that we read about it in grad school, right? But, that's from a long time back. So how do we find the space to fund these interesting things that we know that we need, that we're not entirely sure they're all going to work, to find the ones in that red team, blue team process that get there? And, I think this has been a problem all along. It's hard to sell some of these systems. It was a little easier in the beginning because you generally only wanted a couple of them, right? So you could fund things in the research lines and buy a few. But even there, we look back at the history of something like Global Hawk, look at all the controversy over the cost and this and that. The other thing, it was easier when we looked at just a few systems. Now when we want to really transform the force, which I think everyone does, we want to see that happen. We need to see more advocacy for this. And I think it has to come from what Dr. Roper was talking about, the understanding that this is a fight like no other. And that even if, as we all hope and intend, we continue to deter China in the long term, that there is a deterrence force that we need, and there is a commercial application to all of this as well. What's the good of deterring China across the Pacific if we lose every market on the rest of the globe to that technology colossus, right? So we need to bring these systems more to the center of what we're doing. And I've talked about that I like to see experimentation and the connection to urgent requirements to make this happen. But we do also have to realize that, we are making some transformative decisions, and go ahead and push for and advocate those. Very difficult to do right now. And I think it can be very, very frustrating.
Rose, one point that Dr. Grant makes that is worth pulling the thread on is that the last few decades of acquisition, your choice was to build something that would be a demonstrator, far different than what you would do operationally. Or if you committed to build that production quality unit, your only real option was to go into mass production to get the economic order quantities to make the system somewhat affordable. And now that the fourth industrial revolution appears to be happening with digital engineering and open architecture and agile software, creating a new way to build systems. And we've seen a few fantastic examples of it within the Air Force, particularly with the creation of the flight demonstrators for the T-7 program in 3 years. That hasn't happened since 1958, when third generation fighters were the newest thing in inventory, or the speed at which ground-based strategic deterrence has been able to get its complicated design done, or the successful full-scale flight demonstrator for next generation air dominance. Digital engineering and all of the other things that encompass this so-called fourth industrial revolution are lowering the cost to design and get into assembly, especially assemblies at small scale. When you walk down the halls of defense primes, you'll often be on a hall where there are pictures of past platforms, and they'll have the date that they were made. And there are multiple new platforms coming out, even in given years, in the 40s and the 50s. And then you hit the 70s and 80s and things slow down. The 90s and the 2000s, things get sad. think digital engineering is going to bring that era back if the Pentagon has the wherewithal to change the way it acquires, to be more based on cost, schedule, and agility than cost, schedule, and performance. Performance came into being, I think, when acquisition was slow and the moves were generational. But just the success seen from T7 and NGAD should tell us we need to shake ourselves and ask ourselves, why are we only doing or building a few new things? When the Air Force in particular was born at a time where air power was in flux and it had to experiment with multiple new things at the same time, knowing any of them may need to go into production, and it successfully did that and won the Cold War. That kind of freedom is coming back. My biggest fears will stay entrenched in generational mass productions as our only way to do new capabilities that can be scaled, and that is too slow to compete against China.
Could I just add to that real quick? You know, you're so right about the 1990s and the 2000s. And yet the one thing that was different in that time period was we did not feel we had a peer adversary. And we were willing to do all this stuff with all those crazy, you know, jets that you referenced and all the difficulties when we knew we had to beat the Soviet Union. You know, all our military commanders are telling us we have to be able to beat China, beat and deter, okay? We've got to get that mindset, and then all of this is possible. But, you know, if we sit back here and say, well, you know, we're not really competing, it's not really an adversarial relationship, that is not what the military indicators are. It is, we must treat this as an adversarial relationship. As Americans, we would like to just stay home and enjoy our beautiful country and have the world be just fine. And I think it's always hard to build consensus, but we're at that point again. We need to build consensus to take this on. That's what's going to enable these systems to move forward.
Agree. We also computerized before the Internet of Things did. So even at the F-22, we went from aircraft just being mechanical things to aircraft being mechanical and electrical and computerized things across every subsystem. And that really slowed down acquisition and multiple new technologies having to be incorporated on one platform. Well, now we don't have to wait on technologies that we create internal to the government, because technologies are being created all of the time in private tech ecosystems driven by private investment. So the model we had was one where we had to invent, and then we had to manifest that in a platform we could buy at scale. And invention is slow. And what we're not is an adopter. And the government needs to become adopter, because 4/5 of our opportunity, if you just calculate R&D spending, 4/5 of the R&D spending in the nation is commercial, with so very little of it being tapped for our military.
That's a great point, and thank you both. So we will now turn to the audience Q&A portion of our panel. As a reminder, if you'd like to submit a question, there should be a submit your question here button directly under your video player. And I know we tweeted out the link as well. Our first question comes from Matt Strohmeyer, one of CSIS's military fellows. Says, Dr. Roper, it's great to see you again. I really appreciated your comment that the DoD is no longer conversant in sort of the tradecraft required for the speed chess of strategic competition, such as we possessed during the Cold War. What do you recommend as some ways that we can, again, cultivate these ways of thinking and these processes for procurement that can create deterrent effects?
It's a great question. I really do miss working with all the great men and women that were part of our wonderful team in the Air Force. I don't think it's rocket science on how to get this tradecraft back. We just have to value it. And we have to live, eat, and breathe the strategic competition every day. And I'll tell you, the urgency isn't there. You can get everyone to agree China is the most important thing, but it rarely seems the most important thing on any given day based on what we do. So what do you need to do to get it back? You need good intelligence, which I'll tell you, we have a fantastic intelligence community so that you understand the direction an adversary's going to the best extent that you can. You need very good analysts, people like Dave Ochmanek at RAND, or the net assessment team, and think tanks like CSIS to help look at the adversary's objectives and ours, our investments and theirs, and then simply doing the permutations of, does this thing, if shown, give greater advantage to us than hiding it. And when should that be done? It's fairly simple to realize that. And the first example of doing this, because everything we did in the Strategic Capabilities Office was classified, but the first example of trying to get this capability back was when we worked with the Navy to reprogram the Standard Missile-6 to also be a ship killer. Well, the reason that we decided to acknowledge it, the reason that Secretary Carter did that, is that without the SM-6 being a ship killer in our inventory, it didn't appear that the Navy had enough ship-killing missiles. So how do you go engage allies and partners and assure them? And so I bring that example up because I think often reveal and conceal immediately jumps to red and blue, where the most important thing is green. It's really, what do our allies and partners think about us? I think that is more important on the whole as we compete against China, that we continue to reaffirm and assure allies and partners and new potential allies and partners that the U.S. is ready for whatever contingency. So in red blue thinking, we need to bring a stronger component of green, and the SM-6 was a great example of green thinking, and I would argue green thinking done right.
Thank you very much for the answer. Dr. Grant, would you also like to build on that, or we have another question for you?
I would just, that was great, but I would just add that, what that leads me to say is that we also need to be seen as the world leader in uncrewed systems. I think that we are from a military perspective, and that part of the evidence for that is the great integration of so many different systems across our services at the tactical level. And yet we've seen over the past that it was often really difficult to sell some of these systems abroad. We've seen China really move into some markets overseas and selling systems. We don't want that to be happening. We want to make sure that there's no question that the United States is the world leader in this area.
Absolutely. Our second audience question, I think we'll go to you, Dr. Grant, first. And with Teresa Graves of Honeywell Global Security asks, with autonomy being necessary in the future to compete with China, what are some of the things the military is doing to sort of start heading in that direction now? And what are some of the safeguards that are being discussed to protect against inadvertent strikes or cybersecurity vulnerabilities?
Well, that is a long agenda. I mean, and it's exactly right. Those are exactly the right questions to focus on. I think that, as I said a little earlier, the greatest area of incorporation is through the manned-unmanned teaming. That is where you see the various levels of that going on, and what is the level of trust? Where is the human in or on or next to the loop in this case? The cybersecurity piece, whole separate possible discussion, but no question here, you've got to have every piece of that, not just the security and authenticity of your data, but the ability to have let's call them just the secure communications links that go from the intention out to the tactical edge. And you need the edge technology to organize that data on the tactical edge as well. Huge set of considerations, the kind of thing that we didn't have to worry about as much when we were developing, I don't know, the F-117 or the B-17 or things like that, but that now literally determine, even in Dr. Roper's example of SM-6, if you've got to have the right data, you've got to have the right communication, you've got to know that that's the right ship, and luckily we know how to do that. We've got to make sure that that is there. I think in terms of the comfort level of safeguards, I'm pretty comfortable at this point because we do still have so much conscious thought going in to how to optimize the manned-unmanned teaming. But every place I see this desire to make sure that commander's intent, that the mission orders and the laws of war are absolutely part of this. Don't forget the last 20 years of counterinsurgency conflict. Not perfect, but every target, every time, analyzed for collateral damage, for what fits within the guidance. And that's something you don't hear as much about anymore, but it's, I think, very much deeply embedded into the fabric of military operations at this point. And that carries over as we move to more manned-unmanned teaming and into the autonomy piece. Now, at some point, we're going to have to let that leash get real long in order to strike something rapidly enough And that's going to depend on, as Dr. Roper said earlier, that good pattern recognition, that automatic target recognition. At some point, that's going to be crucial to the success of a piece of that tactical mission. But I think we'll know when that time has come, and I think we'll be able to do the right thing.
I'm a little less comfortable on cyber posture because the military departments are just simply behind on the latest software trends, and security has become such a comprehensive part of how software is designed, very similar to how quality became a fundamental part of how things were manufactured after Toyota created their Kanban system. That has now happened in software, and military is mostly behind it. And so huge open source initiatives being driven by Google, like containerization or Kubernetes and Zero Trust, offer fundamentally different approaches to keep systems safe. And they're relatively unadopted by the military. I will say the Air Force did a great job of being one of the first organizations to lead that charge. It's because we had a lot of great people who wanted to be very good at software. But at a minimum, we have to keep up with commercial trends and commercial standards, because the next generation of the Internet of Things, which will be driven by 5G and more autonomy at the edge, it's not going to be entertainment-based autonomy. It's going to be industrial, things that help produce things that have safety implications, medical implications. That Internet of Things 2.0 is going to need the same kinds of security that the military does. And if we find ourselves behind this tech trend, we'll increasingly become an obsolete military that's vulnerable to attack. And I took some Air Force equipment to DEF CON, which had not been done before, and let hackers try to see if they could get in, and they were able to. And so I'm a big believer that if you stick your head in the sand and pretend you're secure because no one's ever seen your system before, that's a very poor posture to be in. There are lots of castles in Europe that are burned down because their builders thought they had such a comprehensive wall that no one could get through them. There are many more keeps that are still in place because there were multiple levels of security inside each other. And new commercial technology provides multiple levels of security. It presumes the adversary will get in, and then you have a way to deal with it after it does.
Thank you. And while the keep builders aren't here to ask anymore, it seems a very prudent analogy. And so one of the things that I know you touched on earlier is a little bit is this, the US has a very strict regulatory environment in some ways, and in some ways perhaps needs to be very prudent in the standards that it asks for going forward. And so what should we as citizens be asking for? What standards should we ask for?
I think for uncrewed systems, I think we should be asking that the same military standard of safety and reliability be transitioned to systems that are fully or nearly fully autonomous, that are first used for military purposes, and that set the stage for those same class of systems to be used for commercial uses. The military will set the standard for this. It will be too challenging, I think, for civilian authorities to do it. And there's a huge potential for a new drone-based economy to give a huge advantage to whatever nation is able to drive its norms and standards. The United States is the trusted provider of security. And so if it engaged on uncrewed systems only to get autonomy into the inventory, that's a noble effort. It's needed for security, but it falls short of the vision it should have. It should view itself as leading the charge, not just for the military itself, but for the nation. And what I saw is that in areas of deep tech, whatever the military standard was, it more or less became the basis for the civilian standard. And I think uncrewed systems with autonomy is a great future example where the military can be a catalyst, not just an inventor.
Wonderful, thank you both. I realize we are just about exactly at time, so I want to say thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again to General Atomics for making this panel possible, and thank you all so much for joining us. Please do be sure to check out our brief and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks for